Hello there and welcome back, my friends. Welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to be answering one of the most common questions I get regarding macroalgae, and that is, which nutrients should you and can you be using in your macroalgae tank or in your refugium to keep your macroalgae growing really well. One of the biggest long-term issues with macroalgae is the fact that it can burn itself out really quickly. Once it gets going, it can use up a lot of the available nutrients really quickly. It will start to then decline and start to go white potentially, and then just die out. And it happens a lot, especially with people who use Chaeto in their refugiums. It does a really good job, and then it just all melts within a week or so. And this is all to do with nutrients. To answer this question, we need to actually understand why you would keep macroalgae in your aquarium. So keeping macroalgae is becoming more and more popular. It's more and more accessible as more different species of macroalgae are available on the market. The main reason most people would keep it though would be in your refugium. You put macroalgae in there like Chaeto or some sort of Caulerpa or Ulva, and essentially the idea is it grows really quickly, and it takes all the nitrates and phosphates out of your water column, meaning that your corals have way better water quality and your tank is nice and healthy. The second reason though, and that's becoming way more popular now, is actually keeping macroalgae as a display item itself. Keeping macroalgae as your main display in your tank, so keeping essentially a planted reef tank, is something that I do pretty much exclusively in my saltwater tanks. And this has more requirements in terms of the amount of nutrients you need to provide these tanks, because there's more macro, they grow faster, and they just suck out the nutrients so quickly. You can go from boom to bust really fast. How do you know then when to add nutrients to your aquarium? It's very similar to if you had a freshwater planted tank. Most of the time in a freshwater planted tank, you'd probably add your liquid fertilizers once, if not twice a week. And in a reef tank, you want to follow a similar sort of regime in terms of dosing. One thing you can't really do in a macroalgae tank though is put a substrate down in which the macroalgae can draw nutrients from. And the reason is macroalgae doesn't really draw nutrients from its roots. It uses them as a holdfast, so it uses its roots to kind of keep itself attached to whatever substrate it's trying to live on. The nutrients tend to be drawn through the stolon or through the leaves themselves. So this means that you have to really use a liquid fertilizer. There are easy ways of telling whether or not you need to add fertilizers to your macroalgae tank. And the easiest one to spot is the fact that your macroalgae starts to turn a pale colour. Now, I used to think that macroalgae turning a pale colour was actually too much light and too much exposure to too bright of a light. But subsequent experimentation with lighting and fertilisers leads me to believe now that the whiting out of macroalgae is more to do with lack of nutrients, and the biggest nutrient that it's lacking is normally iron. And that's one of the easiest ways to tell if you need to fertilize your aquarium. It's to do with the coloration, the pigmentation of your macroalgae. Any paleness would indicate some kind of nutrient deficiency. Another thing you can kind of look at is if the macroalgae has grown really well, really quickly, and then suddenly starts to stop growing as fast. And this is normally easier to see in things like Chaeto or Caulerpa, green macroalgae, which grow faster. A lot of the time they will really flourish initially when you put them in there, and then they'll suddenly slow down and sometimes even die back. And that's normally to do with fertilizers and nutrients, because they've run out of a certain thing that they were using up really quickly, and now they can't get any bigger because it's gone. And these are the two indicators that I use when determining whether I should add fertilizers, and to some extent which fertilizer I want to add. So the nutrients which most macroalgae need are very similar to plants you would keep in your fish tank, your freshwater tank. And to some extent they're very similar to the nutrients that corals use, but obviously they may use them up a bit faster than a coral would. And these can be broken down into your macronutrients, mainly nitrates and phosphates, and your micronutrients, something like iron, and then other ones here like manganese, zinc, boron, copper, and molybdenum. Now there are obviously more micronutrients than on this packet. You can see in this other company, Flourish, this is Seachem's product, it has a more extensive ingredients list. So this is something you want to look at when choosing your nutrient base, because some are more limited than others, and these nutrients in particular are targeted more towards the freshwater side of things. There are a few companies now that are doing specifically marine nutrients, so you've got things like Brightwell, Chaeto, Grow, and they're more targeted towards your marine species of algae, more to do with Chaeto than anything. One thing you'll notice though is in these freshwater nutrients you've got copper. Now, in saltwater there is copper present, but it's not at that high of a level. So if you're keeping corals, you want to be really careful not to use a nutrient that's got too much copper in, because obviously copper's no good for corals. So we want to be really careful. This one here I've been using for about a year, and I had no issues with using this particular blend. But I'm going to be changing from this one to my own prepared blend at some point, just to remove that copper for long term, because copper can build up within your marine system. The Flourish has a lot less copper in it. It's got barely anything in there in terms of copper. So if you're going to be using something that isn't like Chaeto Grow, which is already prepared for marine tanks without copper in it, then I would recommend Flourish here, because Flourish I've been using for quite a while as well, and that lack of copper can really help. You might notice as well that there's two types of fertilizer on my desk here. We've got powdered fertilizer and we've got a liquid pre-prepared fertilizer. The reason I use a lot of powdered fertilizer is because it goes a lot further. I can get litres and litres of fertilizer out of these powders, and I've got over 1,000 litres of salt water to fertilise, and it's heavily planted, so doing this route is a lot cheaper for me. But if you've only got a small or a reasonably sized tank, then the liquid pre-prepared fertilisers are perfectly fine. Now in terms of micro and macronutrient dosing, the main thing that you're going to be dosing really are your micronutrients. One of the biggest micronutrient that runs out is iron. If you don't dose anything else, I would suggest you at least dose iron once a week, because iron seems to be the most important, or one of the most important micronutrients for macroalgae to grow. I have seen massive differences between dosing and not dosing iron in macroalgae tanks, and you can just see overnight almost the colour of the macroalgae changes. It becomes more vibrant, it grows faster. So I would definitely suggest using iron. I use 13% iron. That's quite a strong iron. You don't have to use 13%, but I was finding that the 8.4% of this mix here wasn't quite strong enough. And then we have the macronutrients. A lot of people add macroalgae to their marine tanks to actually remove macronutrients. Phosphates, nitrates, these are the ones which people want to get rid of. But as I've said before, once the macroalgae has consumed all of this, then it starts to die back, and that's because it runs out of food. So you may actually end up in a situation where you need to add phosphate and nitrate back into your marine tank, and it may seem counterintuitive to do that, because you're thinking, well, that's what I wanted to get rid of and now I have to add it. But if you want your macroalgae to survive long term, and your fish or whatever's in your tank isn't producing enough of these two, you may need to be adding your nitrates and your phosphates back into your reef tank. And the other nutrient, macronutrient, that seems to be used up a lot by macroalgae is magnesium. This took me by surprise initially. When I first set up my macroalgae systems, I didn't realise this would be so important, and I actually neglected to test it because I thought, well, it's macroalgae, it's not a coral, why would I need to test my magnesium? Because my alkalinity seems to be fine, my calcium seems to be fine. Then I tested my magnesium and it was sub 1000. So macroalgae suck out magnesium like anybody's business. It's part of chlorophyll, I believe, so make sure you test your magnesium regularly. And finally, we have the question of carbon in your macroalgae tank, and we're talking CO2 as well as liquid carbon. I haven't tested CO2 in a macroalgae tank. So in a freshwater tank, you'd add CO2, and that's a gaseous form through a bubbler, and obviously plants love it, but it has the problem of lowering the pH. So I haven't tested that because there will be a problem with pH. If anyone has tested it, let me know, leave a comment. One thing I have tested though is liquid carbon to see if it makes any improvement. I've tested it in one of my 125 litres tanks, and it didn't really do a great deal. I haven't seen any real difference in growth rate or in coloration or anything like that. One thing I haven't seen either is anything dying, because a lot of the time this liquid carbon can kill off algae in your freshwater tank like blackbeard algae and so on, but it hasn't killed anything in terms of that. So as far as I know at the moment, adding extra carbon in the form of liquid isn't really worth doing, and adding CO2 in the terms of gas, I haven't tried it, but I would assume it would lower the pH, crash the pH of your tank, and if you've got corals in there, that's bad news. Thanks for watching. I hope this video has been helpful. I've tried to put something together off the top of my head in terms of how I fertilise and what I fertilise. This is kind of an ongoing experiment for me. This is by no means kind of the answer to it. This is just what I'm doing at the moment. I am looking into contacting a UK-based fertilizer company. They put together blends of powders specifically for whatever their client wants, and what I'm going to be looking into is creating my own blend of fertilizer for macroalgae. I don't think initially it will contain nitrates and phosphates because most people don't want that in their aquariums. It will focus mainly on the micronutrient side of things, particularly iron and other things like that. I will be removing the copper, but hopefully that's something I'll be doing in the next 6 months. I'll be testing it at home initially to make sure it works first of all, and also safe for salt water. I don't want any nasties happening to other people, but should that all go right, then I will hopefully be bringing out my own branded macroalgae fertilizer. I don't know yet whether I'm going to be selling it in a powdered form, which you mix yourself, or whether I'm going to be making it into a liquid form in a bottle like this. Let me know what you'd prefer, if you've got any sort of ideas. So anyway, thank you for watching. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have liked the video, please leave a like and a comment below, because it really helps me get seen on YouTube. Also, if you are new to my channel and haven't subscribed yet, make sure you subscribe to see more videos like this and on other subjects as well. I cover a lot of different topics on this channel. So once again, thank you for watching and happy fish keeping.